I just want to start with a couple of thoughts linking the theme of dignity with the Arab uprisings. And it's been on my mind a little bit because, in fact, I will cite some things from this project. I have been, over the past couple of years, finishing a book that is coming out next month called The World Through Arab Eyes, Arab Public Opinion and the Reshaping of the Middle East. And part of that book was really to interpret what is driving the Arab people. What is motivating them? It's not just in terms of leading them to the extraordinary uprising that we have been witnessing, but what has been propelling them, what do they want throughout, and how are they likely to behave in the coming months and years given that. And so I have focused a lot on the notion of Arab identity and how to interpret it, and with it, a kind of an interpretation of what Arabs mean by dignity. And let me start by saying that if you look back at 2010, particularly after the start of the Tunisian revolution, when we had this street vendor, Mohammed Bouazizi, kill himself. Initially, if you recall, the news were, we are witnessing, quote, food riots in Tunisia. This was about food, as it was portrayed. And of course, the Bouazizi story had an aspect of food to it. It was very much connected to somebody taking away his livelihood in the street cart that he had. And no question that dignity also is connected with food, we understand that. But it was much bigger than that, and it was really about the humiliation. That was only part of the humiliation, but how he was treated by even low-level bureaucrats. And that humiliation was, in many ways, a symbol of what drove the Arab revolutions. And in fact, it's interesting because we had in the morning heard a lot of really excellent ideas about dignity and the concept of dignity, but we didn't hear once its antithesis, humiliation. And in part, I think it may be that we started with it as a concept defined intellectually in relation to rights, particularly rights and human rights. And therefore, we're really entering into a kind of a philosophical definition of what human rights are and what dignity is as a right. But what we have not really analyzed enough is the extent to which it's a motivating factor in human beings, separate from whether it is considered a right or not considered a right. It is that it explains much of what people do historically, and certainly in the Arab world. And more than dignity itself, the pursuit of dignity, that is its absence, the humiliation, as a driving force in what people do, both individually and collectively. And sure, motivation is connected to expectations which are connected to notions of rights. So it's not that it's disconnected from the idea of rights, but what I would like to focus on is not the philosophical treatise about what people want, but the pursuit of dignity as a factor in what Arabs do, and how we cannot really understand what they do and what they seek without understanding the pervasive sense of humiliation and the pursuit of dignity that they seek. And it's not a surprise, by the way, that when you look at what Arabs chanted in the streets of Cairo, or chanted in the streets of Tunisia, or Libya, or Yemen, or Syria, particularly right after the toppling of the Tunisian and the Egyptian regimes. I was there. I was there within a few days of the toppling of Mubarak in Egypt in Tahrir Square. And there was a chant that was mesmerizing, hundreds of thousands of people. Irfa rasak fawq anta Masri. Raise your head high, you're an Egyptian. The same chant was found in Libya right after the toppling of Gaddafi. Irfa rasak fawq anta Libi. The same thing was chanted in Yemen. And so it is about raising one's head. And this raising one's head is really something that we need to try to capture. What do people mean? What is it? Why wasn't they raising their heads? And what did they mean by wanting to raise their heads? And I'd like to analyze that a little bit. In some ways, I talk about it a lot in my book, particularly on the issue of identity. And here I'd like to add one more wrinkle to the issue between rights and motivation, that we must not decouple individual dignity from collective dignity. There are two themes that are very, very closely connected. And I want to, in some ways, in the Arab world, it is very difficult to understand what people mean by dignity by separating individual dignity from collective dignity. And it's very, very clear in the Arab case, and I'm going to give you multiple examples, which is going to be the core of what I talk about. I also want to say, before I address specifically the issue of the uprisings and how Arabs define this dignity that they seek, and what is it that they find extraordinarily humiliating in the state of affairs. I want to say that the kind of motivation that we witnessed and are witnessing in the Arab world, in every country, isn't new for the Arab world. The instrument is different. But I would say even the wave of violence that we witnessed in the late 1990s and the early 2000s were very much connected to a pervasive sense of humiliation. And I think in our simplistic analysis of terrorism, we never looked so much at motivation. We only looked at the people who are doing the organization, some of whom are cynical or fanatical or ideological or doing the things for the wrong reasons, instrumentally, as political, exploiting a public sentiment. But they have receptivity at the public level, both in terms of people who join or people who support them, in large part because of the humiliation that is pervasive. And by the way, I also think that even the suicide bombings that are horrific, obviously, particularly when they're aiming to kill innocent civilians, that there is something equalizing about them between that subject who's humiliated and that person who's seen as an oppressor. There's something of leveling of the field in that we never really fully analyze and try to understand. Humiliation is very, very much present in much of what we witness, both collectively and in some cases even at the individual level in the Arab world. In this particular case, though, I don't think it is hard to miss. I think it is hard to miss the extent to which the driving forces of the Arab uprisings have been about dignity. The question is, what did people mean by it? What is this dignity that Arabs seek? And what I'd like to do is try to separate between one arena, which is the relationship between citizens and the rulers, and another arena, which is the relationship between the rulers and the outside world. And I think one way in which almost everyone in our discourse has analyzed the Arab uprisings is that they are in the core about repressive regimes. That, of course, is true. I mean, there is no question about it. And Arabs despise their repressive rulers and the absence of freedom and the absence of democracy and the absence of human rights, all of which, of course, is true. But here is something I want you to think about. If you look at the past decade, of really since, certainly since 9/11, really since even the collapse of the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations and the advent of the Palestinian Intifada in 2000, that if you look at that decade, what is remarkable about it is not at all that you had new types of repression in the Arab world, or for that matter, that you had a new kind of economic deprivation. You can't make an argument, for example, that in Tunisia you had some unusual economic crisis, the likes of which we hadn't witnessed multiple times over the past several decades. The same thing in Egypt. And you, for one thing, even those people who spearheaded the uprisings were not the most, the poorest or the least educated or people who had the most desperate economic situation, as does happen in revolutions generally. So if you look at that whole decade, what has been striking about it, more than anything else, is really the wars, not the domestic arena. And for example, the violence on the Israeli-Palestinian front, the Iraq War, the confrontation between the U.S. and quote the Muslim world after 9/11, the Lebanon War in 2006, the Gaza War in 2008. And when you look at what it is that people were angry about, even vis-a-vis their governments, they were angry with their governments, obviously, for the straightforward reasons of being ruled by repressive regimes. But they were angry for the governments because they always saw them as subcontractors for Western powers whose aims they disagreed with and in some cases feared. And in that sense, I think you can't decouple their anger with governments from their anger with the Western world. In fact, the most humiliating part, if you look at what happened, especially with the Iraq War, if you're an Egyptian and you ask Egyptians, as I did in my public opinion polls that have been conducted over a decade, their attitudes toward the Iraq War. The Iraq War was opposed by 90% of the Arab people, and passionately opposed by 90% of the Arab people, who thought it was going to go against their interests, against regional interests. And even their governments knew that it wasn't good for them or for the Middle East. And yet these governments not only couldn't stop the Iraq War, but ultimately they not only acquiesced in it, but really participated in it, allowed foreign troops to go through Arab soil, to go through the Suez Canal, to base troops in Qatar. In essence, they were participants. And that is part of the collective sense of humiliation that people witnessed, that certainly translated into a further anger towards the rulers beyond the normal. And if there's anything I would say in that decade that added more anger with the rulers, it wasn't the direct behavior of the rulers toward their citizens, because it was nothing profoundly new in that decade, in historical perspective. It was more in terms of the acquiescence in what these rulers, the acquiescence of these rulers with events outside that were humiliating to the Arabs, very humiliating to the Arabs. The Iraq War was only one. I would say that it was also true of the Lebanon War in 2000, where if you ask the Arab public in Morocco or Egypt or Jordan or Saudi Arabia with whom they sympathized, the sympathy was very clear with the Lebanese over the Israelis. Their governments couldn't stop the war, couldn't do anything about it. And more than that, their governments were seen to actually taking a position that is intended to weaken Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hezbollah was popular in the Arab world. Same thing happened in 2008, close to home for Egypt, where here was a war between Israel and Hamas. The Egyptian public is overwhelmingly sympathetic with Hamas. The Egyptian government is seen to be taking Israel's sides, despite what it said. And for that reason, I think it adds more to that anger of the citizen toward the government itself. But the source of it is far more complicated. You can't extricate that anger and that sense of humiliation simply in the relationship between the citizen and the ruler, because part of it is between the ruler and the rest of the outside world. It is part of the same package, and I'm going to give you further evidence of that now. First of all, I want to come back to this notion of raise your head, you're an Egyptian, or raise your head, you're a Libyan. And to be fair, people didn't say raise your head, you're an Arab, or raise your head, you're a Muslim. They said you raise your head, you're an Egyptian, raise your head, you're a Libyan. And yet it's really interesting how people understood that, because in some ways we have been analyzing this issue of identity and what people mean when they say they're Egyptian or they're Arab or they're Muslim, and how they prioritize it. In fact, what we found over the whole decade, the entire decade, is that when you ask people, you tell them up front that you know that there are multiple things at the same time. They can be Arab, and they can be Muslim, and they can be Egyptian, and they can be Jordanian. But which one is most important to you today? And you force them in some ways to take choice, to make a choice. And what we found over the whole decade in the Arab world, pulling the whole decade in the Arab world, is that identity with the state went down, and identity with non-state, as identity as Muslim and Arab went up. In fact, we found that overall, roughly only about a third who say their identity with the state is most important. Now, they mean many things when they identify themselves as Muslim and Arab. It's a very complicated issue. It's not always political. But here's why it matters. It matters because if your identity is as an Arab and a Muslim, then the government isn't just speaking for when they're evaluating whether the government is doing something good or bad. They're not only measuring in terms of whether the government is doing something good for Egypt or not. They're not only measuring it domestically. If you're a Muslim and the rest of the Muslim world says the Mubarak regime is doing what the Mubarak regime is doing is bad for Muslims, that matters for people within Egypt. The rest of the discourse matters for that country. And even more than that, what we found is that when you ask people directly, do you believe that your government should do what's good for the people of Egypt, or the people of Jordan, or the people of Morocco, or do you think your government should do what is good for, quote, Arabs and Muslims? We find that less than half say government should do what's good for the citizens of these countries. That is, we find that more people say they should do what's good for the outside. That puts foreign policy at the core of their evaluation. Because in the end, we talked about the notion of a human dignity, and when you heard Jack Donnelly, he very clearly suggested that it's not the only kind of dignity that you can have. That this is, when you say about human dignity, you're referring to that which all humans should have in common as a right. But there are other forms of dignity or notions of dignity that people hold that may have to do with their particular identities. And here, identity matters a lot for how people define whether they have dignity or don't, whether they're being humiliated or not. And it's very difficult to break down the individual from the collective, the domestic from the external. It's all wrapped together into this notion of identity. And that foreign policy arena is so wrapped into it that you can see it over the decade. If you look at the decade and say, well, what Arabs were wanting more than anything else is freedom or democracy. Well, they wanted freedom or democracy. That's true. Actually, we polled on this too. It's not that they didn't want freedom or democracy, but here's an example of why that's not just what they wanted, or even most of what they wanted. When we asked them throughout the decade, we have this question. Name the leader that you admire most in the world. And we give them an open question. We don't give them names. Just name outside your own country. We didn't want them to be in a position to evaluate their own rulers. Well, in 2003, 2004, the most admired ruler in the world was Jacques Chirac of France. In 2006, 2007, I believe even 2008, I don't have the data in front of me, it was Hassan Nasrallah of Hezbollah. In 2009, it was Hugo Chavez of Venezuela. In 2010, it was Erdogan, the Prime Minister of Turkey. Now, when you look at these people and say, well, these are people that are aspiring for freedom and democracy, look at this very, very, varied group. So what is the prism? I call it, I say, these questions are not intended to look at, who's popular, obviously. It is, what is the prism through which people are making an evaluation? What is it that they're thinking in the back of the mind when they're saying Hassan Nasrallah, or they're saying Jack Chirac? What is the framework of reference here? What is driving them? What is at the core of their aspiration? What is it that they want when they're referring to these groups? Well, and by the way, think about it also in terms of 2004 or 2005. This is the time when we're all talking about a clash of civilization. We have a clash of values. They're rejecting us for who we are. Here they're admiring a Western colonial, a Western leader of a country with a colonial history. In the middle of a time when, in fact, there was a discourse about the veil in French schools. And they're admiring. Hassan Nasrallah is admired right after the Iraq War, where the discourse in the Arab world, in the Western world, is about the Sunni-Shia divide, the divide between Sunnis and Shia. And most of the people I poll are in Sunni majority countries. And here they're identifying a Shia leader, Hassan Nasrallah, as the most admired leader, including in Egypt. And Hugo Chavez, what do they know about the guy? Where does he come from in 2009? And even Erdogan, people say, okay, here, finally, we got the right person. Here you've got a Sunni Muslim leader of a democratic state that is prosperous, somebody they can embrace. Yeah, but why didn't they choose him in 2004 or 2005 or 2006 or 2007? We've got all that decade. They waited until 2009 to embrace him. What's going on here? If it was because he was a model, they would have chosen him all along. So something else is going on here. So what is this thing that's going on here? Well, it's very straightforward. With Chirac, they admired him because he stood up to George Bush at the UN against the Iraq War, and then hosted Yasser Arafat when he was dying, and treated him like a head of state when Bush was keeping him out of the system altogether. Hassan Nasrallah, he stood up to Israel and the United States in that war, 2006, when no Arab ruler dared do anything at all. And Hugo Chavez, he was the only world leader who actually cut off diplomatic relations with Israel following the 2008 war. The only one. Not even an Arab. All the Arab countries, including Egypt, if you're in the Egyptians, say, well, he's my country. He doesn't do that. Jordan doesn't do that. Hugo Chavez cuts his diplomatic relations with Israel over that. And 2009, when people thought this is an embrace of Erdogan precisely because he was a Muslim Democrat, not at all. Look at the timing of what happened. It was when he stood up to the president of Israel at the World Economic Forum, and then the episode of the ship that resulted in a worsening relations between Israel and Turkey. So what I'm suggesting is that what is driving people here is not really just the notion that they want to free. They want the freedom, but what this tells me is that their anger with the repression, their anger with the dictatorship, their anger with the rulers who are not allowing them to be who they are, who they want to be, who speak for them but don't speak for them. And that anger is very much tied to how these rulers perform on the world stage, not just at home. That all of this is really part of this notion of dignity that I think you can't divorce, and you have to understand, particularly in terms of how Arabs view their relationship with the rest of the world. And I do think that, by and large, Arabs still their frustrations are not necessarily with specific ruler. It's not just Mubarak or Ben Ali. It is with what they see as a repressive political order that is not of their own doing, that doesn't speak for them, that is an instrument of Western imperialism that was created at the end of the Cold War, and they still cannot liberate themselves from it. And they constantly feel a sense of humiliation in that relationship that is that comes to the fore every time you have a confrontation related to it. As we have seen over the past decade, that was the relationship that we have seen the most. And no single issue, in my opinion, represents that more than the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And a lot of people don't understand how central that conflict is to the Arab sense of collective humiliation. Because they look at Arab rulers and say, well, they don't care about it. Yes, many of them don't. Like any ruler, they just want to stay in power. They're not doing much about it. And so when you look at the behavioral consequences, they're not obvious. When you look at even how people might feel on any given day, whether they're Moroccan or Saudi or Egyptian, of course that's not what they wake up thinking. They want to feed their kids, they want to send them to school, but in the background there's something really big that is connected to how they identify themselves. I'm just going to read you something in a chapter I called the Arab Prison of Pain. In which I highlight this issue of humiliation and how it plays into the Arab uprisings. The Palestinian-Israeli conflict remains the prism of pain through which most Arabs view the world. It is not uncommon for people to have a collective historical experience or repeated experience, intense and painful enough to help shape perceptions. For Jews, the Holocaust remains a collective atrocity that inevitably shapes perceptions, fears, and aspirations, even for those who had no relatives affected directly by the Holocaust. By itself, the Holocaust is an extreme case, even in human history, but precisely because of its intensity, it is inevitably linked to more persistent fears many Jews have had, even before and since, about persecution and anti-Semitism. It is hard to understand the global perspectives of Jews in the late 20th century and early 21st without some reference to the Holocaust, even as the issues of Israel and Israeli insecurity have themselves become a contemporary prism. These issues cannot be easily decoupled from the Holocaust past. Collective experiences need not be a single tragic event, however. For African Americans, slavery and the subsequent history of persecution and discrimination have provided a prism that has shaped the outlook of generations. It isn't that an African American wakes up in the morning thinking about ancestors suffering as slaves and all the injustice and humanity that this entails, or that many African Americans have not moved beyond these experiences. It is that even in this case, where the experience is merely a memory, the impact on society, including the continuing economic lag between blacks and whites, is always present. In Palestine, there was neither Holocaust nor slavery. But for Arabs, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict still embodies collective historical and psychological experiences that are integral to the way they view the outside world. The conflict represents not only the painful experience of Arabs losing Palestine in 1948 and facing another devastating defeat in 1967, it is also a reminder of a contemporary Arab history full of dashed aspirations and deep, humiliating experiences, usually tied to the West. Since 1967, Israeli control of East Jerusalem, a city that symbolizes an even older, painful conflict dating back to the times of the Crusades, has added fuel to the fire. But what distinguishes the Palestinian-Israeli conflict from other painful experiences is that it is seemingly unending, with repeated episodes of suffering over which Arabs have seemingly no control. This is an open wound that flares up all too frequently representing the very humiliation that Arabs seek to overcome. If the Arab awakening is in the first place about restoring dignity, about raising Arab heads high in the world, then the Palestinian-Israeli conflict represents dignity's antithesis. So I suggest that, when we are looking today at what's happening in Tunisia or Egypt, the immediate issues are not related to foreign policy. And observers, when they go in there, they notice that they're not directly related to foreign policy, or for that matter, to the Israel-Palestine question. There's struggles for power in an involving situation of confrontation among different groups. But what they miss is that this issue is there in the background, particularly whenever there is something that flares up in the region. And it's very much tied to how they define themselves. And even when you look at the discourse in places like Syria, where you would think this issue isn't at all present in the conflict between a regime that was seen to be anti-Israel and a public uprising, obviously multi-faceted uprising, that you will find that both of them use the issue of Israel. The Assad regime says to discredit its opposition that they're a tool of Israel, and the opposition says that the regime is helping Israel. This issue comes up even in the discourse about power within. I'm just going to end with the thought again that though I have not specifically given a lot of thought to the concept of dignity theoretically, or even in terms of it being a human right, that for me as an analyst of this region, it is really very hard to understand the aspirations that are driving the behavior of people in the Arab world without understanding this sense of humiliation that people experience. And that this sense of humiliation is much more complex than we think. It isn't just about individual humiliation vis-a-vis government. It is a sense of collective humiliation. And it isn't only a relationship between citizens and rulers, but it's also about a relationship between rulers and the outside world. And it's very difficult to understand it unless you look at this overall. Thank you very much.